The vast majority of the people who are employed by the restaurant and hospitality industry are either immigrants, children of immigrants, or lifelong members of the working class. We come from generations of laborers and tradesmen prized for their skills, craftsmen, steelworkers, mechanics, plumbers, teachers, and domestics alike. Chances are the kids from wealthy backgrounds rarely end up in the service industry unless their parents acquired wealth by climbing the corporate ladder. Know what else the working class has in common? It makes up most of the military. As family income increases, the likelihood of ever having served in the military decreases. 96.6% of the U.S. military attended public schools, while private schools account for only 3.4% of those who have served. In short, war or conflict veterans make up a staggering percentage of the working class, meaning that most of us have either been raised by war veterans or are war veterans ourselves. The likelihood of PTSD is 1 in 20 for World War II vets and over 30% for those who served in Vietnam, and that's just what's reported by those who seek treatment. Countless others have suffered in silence due to the cultural stigma surrounding mental health. For decades, suck it up has been the coping mechanism of choice. I had never considered the implications of this until a few months ago. During a particularly difficult meditation, I found myself facing and picking apart an event from my own childhood that had always bothered me. I saw my grandmother's words in my own mother and was hit with a moment of extreme clarity and compassion for her as I realized that I couldn't be angry with her for what had happened because she quite literally had never been taught to consider another perspective outside of her family's. Both my parents were raised by World War II vets, and my grandparents were raised by World War I vets. And both sides of my family struggle immensely with healthy coping methods and emotional expression. One grandfather deflected emotional expression with humor, which often turned cruel, and turned to prescription pills. The other either shut down entirely, exploded in anger, or succumbed to vices that should have put him in prison. One ignored their trauma altogether, while the other projected theirs onto their family. Both showed obvious signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. After 12 years of dealing with it myself, and finally coming out on the other side, I've gotten pretty great at spotting signs of it in others. I've talked to dozens of friends, coworkers, and strangers about this in the last year, and most have childhood experiences that mirror my own. Generational trauma is not a new concept in academic circles, but this awareness rarely trickles down to the average working class person. Most of us in the working class are too busy actually working and don't have the luxury of time to sit around and actually think about, let alone research these types of things. Generational trauma is most frequently discussed in conjunction with slavery, but has been documented in many different demographics, from children of Holocaust victims, war and genocide survivors, refugees, assault survivors, and, not surprisingly, extreme poverty. Many in this industry in particular can attest to the fact that having to choose between paying rent and buying groceries is pretty damn traumatizing in itself. In biology, epigenetics is the study of heritable phenotype changes that do not involve alterations in the DNA sequence. The Greek prefix epi in epigenetics implies features that are on top of or in addition to the traditional genetic basis for inheritance. Basically, epigenetics explains how events in someone's lifetime can change the way their DNA is expressed, and how that change can be passed on to the next generation. Think of epigenetic traits like a switch attached to a gene. That switch can be flipped on or off based on factors in a person's environment and the choices they make. Traumatic events can chemically alter our DNA expression based on environmental changes. For example, if a parent experienced starvation from war or poverty, hoarding food was probably something that kept them alive. The genetic trait which enabled the parent to survive that period of their life, being a tendency towards obesity, for example, was then bad during normal times. The next generation doesn't always show exactly the same trait that their parents developed. For example, in terms of war survivors, it's not that fear itself is being passed down the generations. It's that fear in one generation leads to increased sensitivity to fear in the next. It's really fascinating, and I highly suggest researching it on your own. Offspring of war veterans with PTSD have shown higher depression scores than those of war veterans without PTSD, and also a higher rate of aggression and anxiety than those of non-veterans. I would be willing to bet that the majority of people reading this or listening to this have a veteran with probably undiagnosed PTSD in their immediate family. Children of a parent struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, can sometimes develop their own PTSD, called secondary PTSD. In a sense, the parent's trauma becomes the child's own, and their behavioral and emotional issues can mirror those of the parent. So what happens? We get generations of traumatized people doing the best they can with the limited information available to them at the time, inadvertently passing on their trauma to their offspring because it was never acknowledged, dealt with, and released. We get oversensitive millennials raised by emotionally numb baby boomers who were punished for expressing their sensitivities because they were raised by hardened and traumatized World War II vets who never received the resources they needed to learn how to cope with the abject horrors that they saw and experienced. At some point during the healing journey, trauma eventually manifests as a lot of anger at everything and nothing at the same time. Rage is a state of healing, but many people get stuck in this stage because it's the only coping mechanism that they've ever been exposed to. Most people born in the last century were taught to deal with emotions in one of three ways: lash out in explosive anger or violence, numb everything with substances or distract with vice, or sweep it all under the rug and pretend like it doesn't exist. Explode, distract, ignore. None of these are healthy coping mechanisms. None of these work. Honestly, most of the working class has been dealt a shit hand in life from the very beginning. Lacking concrete examples of emotional regulation, many of us kind of flounder passively through life, getting tossed by the tide from one catastrophe to the next, never able to actually relax and enjoy the small pleasures of simply existing in this world because we're too busy putting out fires and trying to simply survive our own lives. What we see in our outer reality is directly related to what we have experienced in our inner subjective experience of life. If all we have ever known has been pain and struggle, we will be primed to see more pain and struggle in our world. If the only emotions we were exposed to as a child were anger, guilt, and shame, we're going to have a lot of issues experiencing things like happiness and relaxation in our own lives. Overly judgmental people are usually their own worst critic. Bullies have usually been bullied by a parent or peer in their past. Genuinely happy people, on the other hand, tend to have genuinely happy friends, while those conditioned to view life through a lens of negativity and fear tend to form social bonds with others who see the world in similar shades of black and white. We see in others what we have experienced ourselves. It is a cause-effect relationship between our current personal reality and the way we have processed our life experiences. As within, so without. As above, so below. It's well documented that repressed emotions and trauma have a tendency to cause anxiety disorders, and anxiety disorders are often linked to digestive issues and an increased risk of infection. Anxiety can also change the function of the cardiovascular, urinary, and respiratory systems. Disease is often a chain reaction of emotional dysfunction, leading to mental distress, leading to physical manifestation. Yet modern treatments tend to only address the symptoms related to the physical manifestation, instead of taking a step back and looking at the issue from a more holistic perspective. Instead of solely treating the symptoms of IBS, for example, a more effective integrated approach would be to examine the underlying causes of the anxiety, examining both life experience and emotional upbringing to isolate and fully understand the root cause of the anxiety, then tracing the anxiety through all of its physical and mental manifestations, from personality quirks to physical dis-ease. The problem with applying this approach is that the prevailing cultural narrative for the majority of the working class is that talking about emotions makes you weak, which is a real shame because not talking about emotions is literally killing people. We reject alternative methods of coping, such as talk therapy, journaling, CBT therapy, EFT, meditation, yoga, etc., in favor of medication because A, we have been culturally brainwashed into thinking that the only way to fix any physical or mental problem we encounter is with a drug, and B, we have been trained to want quick fixes for deep-rooted problems, and most people will do anything to avoid actually dealing with their issues. A quick side note. I'm absolutely not bashing modern medicine. Modern medicine is absolutely necessary and life-saving in many cases. I'm simply suggesting that in some cases, modern medicine takes the easy route of placation with numbing pills instead of the more difficult route of understanding and addressing the root cause. As a culture, we have become terrified of emotions due to generations of historical trauma and an overwhelming lack of public knowledge and education of how to manage our own state. We desperately want to fit in, so we hide what makes us different. Owning our deeper needs is often seen as selfish, when in reality it is a compassionate act of self-preservation. Instead of seeing ourselves as horribly broken and unfixable, we need to shift our thinking to embrace the radical act of curious self-discovery. We need to ask different questions if we truly want different answers. Why do we react the way we do? What might be causing the physical sensations that we are experiencing? How did our upbringing shape our emotional expression? How have we been taught to respond to pain? When faced with difficulty, do we immediately default to deflection, blame, or people-pleasing? Where did we learn this? When I was first learning about healthy emotional expression, the thing that initially struck me the most was the realization that all emotions are physiological phenomena. Feelings are actual physical sensations in the body, and that each feeling has its own distinctive somatic sensation. Before exploring this, I had really only felt a handful of emotions. Fear, anger, stress, sadness, shame, and guilt dominated my life, occasionally interspersed with brief moments of pleasure experienced mainly through hedonic vice. Things like joy and love and gratitude were concepts that I intellectually understood, but under the heavy filter of depression and PTSD haze were never things that I had somatically experienced. Just like anger has its distinctive warm, tight sensation in the chest and head, joy is physically felt as an all-over tingling sensation of the skin, a sort of somatic ecstasy that's difficult to put into words. Often, I discover that the root cause of a particular personality quirk was way less scary than I had imagined it to be. As an example, for most of my life, I couldn't fall asleep until 2 a.m. or later, spending hours tossing and turning. I tried sleeping pills, alcohol, reading horribly boring books, movies, counting sheep, you name it. Nothing seemed to work. I had written myself off as a night owl, dooming myself to a lifetime of heavy caffeine dependency with no hope of ever getting on a regular schedule. One day, I had a thought to ask my mother what my sleeping habits were like as a child. Was I ever an early sleeper? Her answer floored me. My father worked long, late hours for the majority of my life. And it turns out that my mom regularly let me stay up hours past when most kids went to bed so that I could spend some time with him when he got home. Otherwise, I would have never seen him. In that moment, I realized that I had subconsciously associated staying up late with getting to do cool things with Dad. And much to my surprise, my sleep improved dramatically. I was able to release the identity of being a night owl by identifying where it originated in my subconscious. I'm still not a 5 a.m. riser or anything, but it's no longer a struggle to fall asleep at a decent hour. I mean, midnight counts as decent, right? See what I mean? Not even remotely scary. Older generations set the stage for how things within a family are addressed. If ignoring and minimizing and even accepting the trauma is normal for the family, younger generations will adapt to this way of survival and mimic the behaviors for generations to come. Can you think of anything in your own family that could possibly be linked to generational trauma? Are there behavioral patterns that seem to get passed down from one generation to the next? Could your family include a multi-generational history of stifled emotional responses and/or unhealthy coping mechanisms? Some common behavioral patterns that are linked to generational trauma. Number 1, emotional distance, surface-level conversations, never any depth or realness, a strong desire to conform to societal expectations. Number 2, defensive behaviors around the expressions of emotions. Suck it up, or be a man, things like that. Number 3, denial, refusing to acknowledge that a trauma happened. Number 4, minimization or internalization, ignoring the impact of the trauma and making the traumatic experience appear smaller than it really is. Number 5, unhealthy or unstable relationships, characterized by physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, or verbal abuse. Number 6, addiction, numbing emotions through substance or vice. Number 7, eating disorders, often a manifestation of perfectionism. If I can have a perfect body, I will avoid bad things. Or using overeating as a way to deal with difficult feelings or emotions. Number 8, OCD, usually an attempt to create some sense of predictability and safety, usually seen in people who grew up in very chaotic or unstable environments. Number 9, autism. It's been speculatively linked to passive emotional neglect in early childhood. Number 10, borderline personality. It's often linked to invalidating childhood environments where emotions are ignored or dismissed, leading to emotional dysregulation and an unstable sense of self. Number 11, sociopathy. Usually stems from childhood abuse, neglect, and trauma. A few questions to ask yourself. Did any of my parents or grandparents experience any type of major life trauma? War, violence, assault, the Holocaust, racial, religious, or sexual persecution, immigrant discrimination, etc. Do I or does anyone in my family display any of the behaviors listed above? How was I trained to deal with my emotions? How do my parents deal with their emotions? How did my grandparents deal with their emotions? What is my family's view on therapy, mental health, and admitting that help is needed? Was I ever shamed or punished for expressing my feelings as a child or adolescent? Does mental illness run in my family? What variety, and when did it begin? What did that person experience, and how might they have passed those patterns down to future generations? Do I feel like my parents truly know me and accept me for who I actually am, or do I feel the need to hide parts of myself to gain their approval or avoid their judgment? We can't change the cards we're dealt, but we can change the way we play the hand. We can unlearn what is no longer helpful by learning where we picked it up in the first place, and then consciously choosing to release it. You are not doomed by your genetics, your past experiences, or your socioeconomic class at birth. The only thing that dictates your future is your vision of it. You have a choice in how your life unfolds. Give yourself permission to transcend your family patterns. It's up to you to unlearn what no longer serves you. Did something click with this article? Share your thoughts in the comments or on our forum. Please share this article with anyone who might need it. Siblings, friends, and coworkers are a great place to start. Start a discussion. Be the one to break the cycle. Please visit the text version of this article to find a long list of scholarly articles that corroborate statements made in this thought piece. The link is posted in the video description. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and tap the bell to receive notifications. We upload new videos every Monday.